Okay, so I'll be talking today about learning to predict the facilitative effect of entropy reduction on language learning. And this is very much joint work together with my wonderful PhD student, Ori Lavi-Rothbein, who is sitting here today, so you can approach her with questions afterwards also. Okay, so unlike many of the previous speakers, I'm a linguist and cognitive scientist, and the broader issues I'm interested in are how is language learned and used. And I'm interested in language because it is a fundamental and unique aspect of human cognition. So by understanding how children learn to talk, we will hopefully be understanding something foundational about what it means to be human. And in particular, I'm interested in linking questions of learning, processing, and structure. So using both developmental and psycholinguistic adult data to better understand what it means to know language and how that knowledge is acquired. So over the past years, we've been focused on one particular puzzle, which is not the one I'll talk about in more detail today, but I want to give you a feel of the kind of work we do. So the puzzle that interested us for the past few years is a very big one, and it is why are adults worse language learners than children, despite being better at other cognitive tasks? So as we know, adults rarely reach native-like proficiency in a second language, and I'm guessing all of you have experienced the quite frustrating experience of trying to learn and master a second language as an adult. Adults are not always worse than children, and they seem to find certain domains harder than others. And the interesting question is why? And there are, of course, many, many differences between first and second language learners, between infants learning to talk and adults learning a second language. There are cognitive, biological, and neural differences. There are differences in their learning environment, both in the amount and in the kind of input that learners receive. And there are differences in what they already know, both about language and about the world. And the challenge is to link any of these learner characteristics to the different learning trajectories we see. And our approach has been to focus on the building blocks of language. That is, to ask or to explore what are the initial linguistic building blocks used by different kinds of learners, and how those early building blocks impact subsequent learning. Okay? From the perspective that what you know shapes what you learn. And this has led us to what we now call the starting big hypothesis, which in a nutshell is the idea that children start out with units that are larger and less analyzed than those of adult learners. And they include kind of multi-word chunks like what's this, or in Hebrew, lo bali. And this is a direct result of the fact that infants do not know what words are when they enter the world, something we'll talk about more in a few minutes. Our idea is that learning from larger units is beneficial specifically for learning certain arbitrary relations between words in language, and that adults are less likely to make use of these larger units because of their existing knowledge of words. And we've done a lot of work over the past years to substantiate these claims and basically show that infants and children indeed extract multi-word units, that those can facilitate learning, and that if we make adults learn from larger chunks, we can see better language learning outcomes. And what this offers in general is an experience-based perspective on differences between first and second language learning. It has less to do with what is irreversible, that is the way a mind or a brain changes over development, and more with what is slightly reversible, the experience and the prior knowledge that we have. So in the current project, we're taking the same experience-based perspective to target a very different question, a very different big question. And that is the question of learnability. What makes linguistic information more learnable? Under what conditions do learners show better learning of language? And we're interested in this question from two different perspectives and for two different reasons. The first is to better understand the learning mechanisms and constraints that underlie language acquisition. And the second is to ask or explore the possible effect of these learning mechanisms on the way languages look overall. So if we look at the world's languages, and there are many of them, several thousands depending on who's counting, these languages are very different from one another, but they also share some interesting commonalities. Okay? So in particular, we can see that certain configurations or sounds are more frequent across the world's languages. And the question is why? The traditional answer for many years has been that these commonalities reflect innate linguistic constraints on how languages can be. But over the past not so few years, there's a growing community interested in an alternative answer, which seeks to explain these commonalities or attribute them to our shared cognition. That is, the idea that languages reflect and adapt to cognitive pressures and biases. And we're interested in that perspective. And specifically, the specific factor we're examining in this little project, big project, which this is a little part of, is the impact of entropy on language learning. And by entropy, I mean Shannon's entropy, which we use as a measure of the overall predictability of the environment. So we want to ask whether learners are sensitive to this kind of measure, that is, do they show better learning under certain entropy levels, and whether this sensitivity can help us explain certain structural features of language. So the second part is the more speculative one that I'll get to in the discussion. So there's growing evidence that entropy and similar information theoretic measures impact language processing and structure. Unsurprisingly, we are, as speakers, faster to process material that is more predictable. But interestingly, very little work to date has looked at the impact of such information theoretic measures on language acquisition. And this reflects certain assumptions about the relation between language learning and language processing. Okay? So traditionally, these two are viewed as very separate, and it's evident also in the kind of separation between the community of language acquisition and the community of psycholinguistics. So if, for example, if we're talking about word learning, you learn a lexicon, and then you use it online in processing. These are kind of two separate stages or phases. But if you take the perspective that learning language is simply learning to predict, then the two are inherently linked. And how well or how easily you will learn an individual element should depend not only on its own properties, like its own frequency, but also on its predictability in a given context and the predictability of the environment as a whole, which can be captured using Shannon's entropy. So just to give you a feel for what I mean from the perspective of word learning, which is what we'll focus on, you can imagine trying to learn a pretty low frequency word, showers, in the sense of rain, okay, not taking a shower. This word will be easier to process in a more predictable sequence, so heavy showers versus many showers. But how easy it will be to process it will also depend on the alternatives. So let's say we are in a world where there are only 4 possible continuations to heavy in our little language: showers, boxes, bags, and thoughts. It will be easier. Showers will be more predictable in an environment where it is the more frequent option than in an environment where all options are equiprobable. And this is what entropy can help us capture. So in this talk, I'll show you that entropy reduction does indeed facilitate language learning in both children and adults, focusing on the domain of word segmentation, to argue that lab-based studies underestimate learning by using word distributions that are less predictable than those of natural language, and finally, discuss some speculative implications for language structure, and specifically, the idea that the distribution of words in language is shaped, among other things, by a cognitive pressure to reduce entropy. Okay, so connecting individual biases of learnability to the overall structure of language. Okay, so during their first year, infants have to segment speech, extract words, and start mapping them to objects. And this task of word segmentation is a really challenging one, because spoken language, unlike written language, does not have pauses between words. Okay, if I were to talk like that, that will be highly annoying and very hard to understand. Okay, and just to give you a feel, here's a little snippet of a narrative in an unfamiliar language, and just listen to it and tell yourself or your neighbor how many words are in this. If it works. Whoops, back. That was just the end of it.
To suna cikin wannan gardama sai ga wani matafi.
Okay, you have no idea, right? Even though you are adults, you know what words are, you know what to look for. It is very hard to detect word boundaries in a highly unfamiliar language. And this was a little piece of Hausa, which is a native indigenous language spoken in North America. However, by 6 months, infants can segment words from fluent speech, and they show some rudimentary object label associations. And how they do so, that is how they break into the speech stream, has been studied extensively in the lab in the domain that's often called statistical learning. The basic idea, intuition here, is that humans in general can use distributional information to learn about language, and specifically to detect word boundaries. The relevant piece of information here is the transitional probabilities between syllables. So the TPs, the transitional probabilities in language, in actual language, are higher within words than across word boundaries. Let's take an example, the sequence pretty baby. Okay? The probability of hearing T following pre is much higher than the probability of hearing bay following T. And this reflects the very simple fact that we can say many words after another word, pretty house, baby, car, and so on, but there are fewer sounds that can complement a first syllable to create an actual word. Okay? So this is a true statistic in language, and the question is whether humans can use that kind of information. And the way this is studied in this big literature is by using artificial languages. Okay, so here participants are exposed to an unsegmented speech stream that is composed of recurring triplets of sounds. And the only cue to word boundary is the transitional probabilities between syllables. Then we ask whether learners can distinguish after a very short exposure between real words that appeared together as a sequence and foils, where the syllables appeared but not together. Okay, and this is what a classic segmentation paradigm sounds like and looks like, sounds like. Hope it works.
Na lubi ki beto du ka me ge no di na lubi du ka me na lubi ge no di ki beto na lu.
Okay, imagine listening to that for 15 minutes. You don't do it actually for 15 minutes. It's really annoying, but that is the paradigm, okay? And what you heard at the beginning of the stream, I transcribed it here. It's actually comprised of recurring triplets, okay, which you can kind of learn after the exposure. And a test, I would ask you, which of these is a word you heard before? Nalubi, which is a real one, or nabedi, which is the combination of 3 syllables from 3 different words. Okay. So this is the classic paradigm, and what is shown is that infants, children, and adults can use distributional information to segment a novel speech stream. And this is taken as an illustration of infants' sophisticated learning abilities. This paradigm has been used in hundreds of studies to explore under which conditions, when, what humans can or cannot learn. But interestingly, even though this research has been going on for over 20 years, there are certain limitations to lab-based findings. So generally, we see quite small learning effects that are small effect sizes, not entirely reliable. There's little evidence for the predictive power of such learning for language acquisition in the wild. And from our perspective, what's important is that all of these studies, and there are hundreds of them, use languages that differ dramatically in their entropy from words in natural language. Okay? So in all of these word segmentation studies, they use a uniform distribution where each word appears equally often. And this maintains the consistent difference in TPs. But this is a highly unpredictable distribution that has high entropy. In contrast, in actual language, words follow a very particular non-uniform distribution, which is often called a Zipfian distribution. So this was first noted by a mathematician called Zipf in the 1930s and gave rise to the unpronounceable Zipf's law, which I will not say again. And the basic observation is that the words in language are distributed in a way that has very few high-frequency words and many low-frequency words. But more than that, the words follow a power law distribution, where a word's frequency is inversely related to its rank. What does this look like for actual English? This is taken from the Santa Barbara corpus, which is a corpus of spoken English, and you have basically the frequency of words plotted. And what you can see is that you have the most highly frequent word is I, and it is twice as frequent as the next one, which is the, which is twice as frequent as and so on. And we have this very long tail of low-frequency words. If we log the 2 parts, we get the inverse relation between frequency and rank, which follows a near Zipfian distribution. This kind of distribution is very common in language. So it's found across different languages and different corpora sizes. It's found across grammatical categories. So not only when we look at function words like the, but also when we look only at nouns or verbs or adjectives. It's found also within specific linguistic categories. So if we look at how number words are distributed, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on, they also follow a near Zipfian distribution. Okay? And it is also found, we'll get back to this in the discussion, in non-linguistic domain. So it's not a distribution that's unique to language, but it is very common across various aspects of language. So we first wanted to ask whether this is the kind of distribution that infants are actually exposed to. And so we looked, together with Ori, at several corpora of child-directed speech. This is taken from naturalistic interactions between parents and children across 6 languages with varying corpus sizes and across development. And what we found was that indeed the words that infants are exposed to, infants and children, also follow a Zipfian distribution. So here is the log frequency and rank for English and Hebrew. The Hebrew corpus is much smaller, only 300,000 words versus 7 million, but we see a very similar distribution. We then looked at only the speech directed to very young infants, pre-verbal infants, 6 to 10 months, and it looks a bit different, but it also follows a near Zipfian distribution. Okay, so the words that children hear follow a Zipfian distribution, which is more predictable than the uniform one and has lower entropy than the uniform one. More interestingly, we wanted to see in what ways do actual languages deviate from the uniform. And so to do that, we took 9 corpora of child-directed and adult speech, and we calculated the observed unigram entropy in that corpus, and then the deviation from a unigram entropy under a uniform distribution. That is, how much does the actual entropy deviate from what would be found if words were distributed equally. And just to give an example, for North American English, for child-directed speech, we have 6.5 million words with 35,000 word types. This is actual data, actual corpus. And the observed unigram entropy was 8.99 bits. The entropy under a uniform with the same number of word types was 15.08, and the deviation value was 0.59. Okay? So interestingly, we found very similar deviation values across the different languages and different corpora, and they were all around 0.6, which suggests that actual language is about 40% more predictable than a uniform distribution with the same number of types. Now, we don't think there's anything magical about this particular number, but it gives us a feel that languages seem to deviate in quite similar ways from a uniform distribution. So now that we have this data, we can ask, are children and adults sensitive to entropy such that they will show better word segmentation when entropy is reduced? And will the effect be stronger when the deviation from the uniform is more language-like? That is, are learners more adapted to the kind of deviation that exists in natural language? If so, we will see a nonlinear effect of entropy reduction. Okay? This will tell us something novel about humans learning, language learning mechanisms, and about what children and adults are sensitive to. So to ask this, we used the classic word segmentation paradigm, which you saw before, and we modified unigram entropy in a very simple way by making one word more frequent. So we had our high entropy condition, which is the classic one. It's a uniform distribution. We had a reduced entropy condition, where one word appeared 55% of the time. And we had a language-like entropy condition, and I'll tell you in a minute why it's language-like, where one word appeared 80% of the time. Okay? And we examined accuracy, word segmentation accuracy overall, and for the infrequent words using all the classic parameters here. The way this is the way learning is assessed in all of these studies is by using 2 alternative force choice. Here are 2 words, which one is more familiar? And we looked at both children and adults and quite a large number of both. Okay. And our predictions were that we would see better segmentation in language-like entropy and better learning of the infrequent words in language-like entropy, despite them being less frequent. So here are the conditions that we actually examined. To look at the effect of entropy overall, we compared high entropy, so this is a uniform distribution, for made-up words, okay? Nalubi, Dukame, Genodi, Kibetu. I'm a fluent speaker by now, as is Ori, and each of them appeared 32 times, compared to the reduced entropy condition, where one word appeared 71 times. Each time it was a different word, and the others appeared 19. And the language-like condition, where the frequent word appeared 101 times, and each of the infrequent ones appeared only 9 times. Okay, so just to give you a feel of what the differences in how they sound.
Na lu bi ki be to du ka me ge no
the
di na
uniform.
lu bi du ka me na lu bi ge
That will
no
not
di
work
ki
well.
be to
You
na.
just hear a cacophony. Let's see if I can just play it like this. So this is the reduced entropy.
Ge no di na lu bi ki be to ge no di na lu bi na lu bi ge no di na lu bi na.
And this is the language-like only in its entropy.
Ge no di na lu bi 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 na lu bi
You
du
get
ka
the
me
feel,
na
right?
lu.
Okay. So what do I mean when I call this language-like? When we look at the unigram entropy under these 3 distributions and we look at the deviation, then our language-like condition has a deviation that is similar to what we found in actual languages. Okay? But there's still a reduction in entropy across the 3 conditions. So to test the effect on the infrequent words, we added another condition, a uniform one, where each word was heard only 19 times. And now we can really compare how or whether learning is improved when you hear a word the same number of times or less under a non-uniform distribution. So what did we find? Looking first at the adult data, we found kind of what we had hoped for. Performance improved only in the language-like condition. Okay, so performance was around 65%. This is accuracy overall in the uniform and reduced entropy condition. And this is very similar to what people find using this paradigm. Learning is generally not that great. But it was really improved up to 82% in the language-like entropy condition. Now, of course, this could be driven simply by them having learned the very frequent word. They heard it 101 times. They must have learned it to perfection, and maybe that's what's driving the effect. So looking only at the low-frequency words, we see the exact same pattern. Okay, so words that appeared only 9 times in the language-like entropy were learned much better than words that appeared double the amount of times in either the high entropy or the reduced entropy. And again, we see this nonlinear effect. So the reduced entropy, even though it is a more predictable environment overall, didn't really boost learning at all. Not overall, and not for the low-frequency words. When we look at the effect of frequency and entropy, then of course within condition, there's an effect of frequency, unsurprisingly. The more frequent word was learned better than the less frequent ones. But this is an effect of relative frequency, not absolute. Because the word that appeared 9 times was learned as well, tiny bit better, not significantly, than a word that was heard 78 times under the reduced entropy distribution. So we did this exact same studies with the children, and we found a surprisingly similar pattern. This almost never happens when you do developmental work. Children are always doing something different, but here they seem very much like the adults, except they're worse overall. Okay? So when we looked again at the overall accuracy, we see the same pattern. Performance is improved only in the language-like condition. So 66% versus 60% or lower in the other conditions. The other differences are not significant. Again, this could be driven only by the highly frequent word, but it's not. When we look at the low-frequency words, children only showed learning, that is, they were significantly above chance, only in the language-like entropy condition. Okay, so even though they heard the word only 9 times, they learned it, managed to learn it, which they didn't manage to do when they heard it 19 times in a different distribution. And we see the same kind of effect of relative frequency. So a word that was heard 9 times was learned better than one that was learned 19 times. Okay, so what do these findings show us? They show us that reducing entropy facilitated word segmentation in both children and adults, but only when entropy was reduced enough. And what we seem to find here is a nonlinear effect of entropy reduction. So accuracy improved only in the language-like condition. In addition, we see that learners are sensitive to relative frequency and not absolute frequency. Okay? So before we go any further, we need to ask whether this is really about entropy. So the non-uniform distributions differed from the uniform in other aspects as well. In particular, the language-like, both non-uniform distributions provide a kind of anchoring effect. So you can learn the frequent word fast because it is so frequent, and you can use that as an anchor to segment the other words. And that's probably part of what's happening. But this alone cannot explain the nonlinear effect. Okay? So the reduced entropy condition, the one where one word appeared 55% of the time, also provides anchoring. So the infrequent words appeared next to the frequent one 70% of the time. Right? There should be some anchoring going on there also, but that doesn't seem to boost learning at all. We considered several other explanations, and I'm happy to hear more. The differences in average TPs, ruling out foils with frequent syllables. We've ruled all of them out on the basis of our data. I can go into that. And it seems that none of them can explain the nonlinear effect, that is the lack of improvement in the reduced entropy condition compared to the big improvement in the language-like entropy condition. So our tentative conclusion now is that learners are sensitive to the overall entropy of the language in a seemingly nonlinear way. What are some immediate implications of this? Theoretically, it shows us that learners are sensitive to entropy in language learning. Okay? Learning is facilitated in certain entropy levels. Methodologically, it suggests that lab-based studies are underestimating learning. So when we do these kind of tasks, we want to isolate one factor and see if learners are sensitive to it. But the way it's done actually makes or creates detrimental learning conditions. To give you an example, and we have done this in the past ourselves, you take this kind of classic paradigm, you test 6-year-olds, you see they're completely at chance, and you deduce that they are not able, if using transitional probabilities at this stage, to do word segmentation. But that's clearly not true. Right? Given a different non-uniform distribution, it's very possible that they will be able to show learning. So why do we get this greater facilitation at the language-like entropy? And the honest answer is that we don't really know yet, but we have some ideas. Okay? So the general gist of it is that the frequent words are learned anyway. But to learn infrequent words or novel words, we need a large enough contrast between the frequent and the infrequent. And this may in fact be thought of as a linguistic parallel of stimulus-specific adaptation. That is, we get stronger responses, in this case, stronger learning, to infrequent deviant stimuli. And what we're doing is we're currently exploring or trying to understand why exactly this happens by doing several things. The first is to explore other entropy levels. So is it really nonlinear? We only tested 3 levels. We can't really say that yet. We want to extend it, and we have, to other linguistic domains. Will a skew distribution facilitate not only segmentation, but also learning words and learning syntactic relations? And the answer seems to be yes, and also in a nonlinear way. And we want to link this to real-life language outcomes. So one interesting puzzle is when you look at children's early vocabularies, it's very correlated with frequency. Right? Words that appear more often are learned earlier. That's no surprise. But within this early vocabulary, there are also some low-frequency words. And what we want to know is whether those early acquired low-frequency words appear in lower entropy environments in language itself. Can we provide a kind of explanation for why they're learned earlier despite their lower frequency? And okay, so to give you an example of one of the other studies we're doing, and then I'll move to the speculative discussion. It turns out that not only words, but also the objects that infants see show a Zipfian distribution. So in a recent study looking at what infants see using head-mounted cameras, so actually what the infants themselves see, it turns out that the distribution of objects is also Zipfian. There are a few very frequent objects and many that are seen less frequently. And so based on this, we wanted to kind of combine the segmentation and word learning and ask whether we can enhance learning object label associations by similarly reducing entropy. So we took the classic word segmentation study, but now we added a visual cue, basically a mapping, so that each word appears with one of these objects. And we compared learning in the same kind of conditions, the classic uniform distribution, these are existing studies, reduced entropy, and a language-like entropy. And I guess that this movie won't show, but we will see. You may only get the... Okay, you're getting only the image and not the sound, but basically whenever a shape changes, you hear the word in together with the shape. And the mapping is consistent. And what we found here is that indeed there was improved segmentation and word-object mapping in language like entropy. Now, this is a direct follow-up to one of our previous studies where we claimed that young children, that is 6 and 7-year-olds, are not managing in the lab. They clearly do so in the world, but in the lab, they don't manage to integrate multimodal cues. That was our conclusion based on this classic paradigm. However, once we used this language like entropy, it turned out that conclusion was not correct. When you make the environment more predictable, children at the same age are capable of learning these object label associations, okay, which makes a lot of sense because clearly they're doing this in the world, so it was more something about the paradigm than about the actual knowledge that they were not managing to do. Okay, so now I want to go back to the kind of larger puzzle that we started with, and this is why are Zipfian distributions so prominent in language? And there are many, many different explanations. This has been studied for over almost 100 years. Many of these explanations are purely mathematical or physical. That is, they say this is an outcome of certain physical or mathematical laws. Some of them make reference specifically to language. So basically, by suggesting that this distribution is, offers an advantage for communicative efficiency or for optimal coding of the language code. And what we're interested in is the possible cognitive sources of the distribution in language. Okay, now importantly, as I said before, these kind of distributions are found in other domains in the physical world, and we don't think that they have any cognitive source. But the question is whether in language there are also cognitive pressures that push languages towards these distributions. Okay, and this relates back to the general interest in asking how learning biases impact language structure overall. Okay, so the idea that languages reflect and adapt to cognitive pressures. And specifically, our idea is that Zipfian distributions may confirm a learnability advantage by maintaining an optimal contrast or deviation from the uniform for the largest number of samples and sample sizes. Now, clearly, this needs to be shown mathematically. Which we're working on. I'm just going to give you the intuition here. So let's say you have this kind of distribution from English, and you hear a sentence, and the average length of a sentence in adult-to-adult speech is between 7 and 8 words. Okay, the idea would be that if you sample randomly from this distribution, you will end up getting a good number of samples that maintain this deviation from the uniform that we saw in the overall language. Okay? So intuitively, it's easier to learn new words in certain entropy levels. Now, what we found and shown may be simply a consequence of how language is structured, right? Learners are sensitive to the kind of entropy levels that languages show. But at the same time, the sensitivity could create an ongoing pressure to maintain this contrast. And if this is true, we can make several highly speculative predictions. Okay, one of them is that languages change to become more Zipfian during emergence. That is, in situations of language emergence, for example, in emerging sign languages or in the move between pidgins and creoles, we will see a move from more uniform to more Zipfian distributions. The second is that languages maintain this deviation from the uniform as they change. Okay, that is, introducing new words into the language will not change the overall structure, but everything will kind of shift around to maintain this same deviation that we've been seeing. How can we test these ideas? And this is what we're currently doing. One way is to do corpus-based investigations of unigram entropy during language change and emergence, and we have such situations in the world that we can look at. The second is to use iterated learning studies to try and simulate language emergence in the lab, and I'll give you a taste of that. So iterated learning paradigm in general is a paradigm developed by Kirby, Cornish, and Smith in 2008. And the basic idea is to try and simulate language emergence or cultural transmission in the lab. The paradigm is extremely simple, and it's kind of a Chinese telephone or telephone shavur in Hebrew. You create a language, an artificial language that has no structure, random mapping between labels and forms. You teach that your first participant. Their output is the input of the next participant. And so it goes until you have generations of learners. The question is, what happens to the initial language after 10 generations of transmission. And in this kind of set of studies, what one sees is that structure increases over time. So both adults and children create structure in the language through the process of transmission. So similarly, and we've done this kind of work with children in the lab, but similarly we can take the same general idea and ask whether learners turn uniform distributions into Zipfian ones through the process of transmission. And if so, it would be a kind of proof of concept that there are individual biases towards a Zipfian distribution, and that those can be amplified over time to change the language overall. Okay, so to summarize, what we've done here is we've looked at word segmentation as a case study. We've seen improved segmentation in language like entropy for both children and adults. This shows us learner sensitivity, or illustrates learner sensitivity to the information theoretic structure of the environment, not only frequency, but overall predictability, indicating that lab-based studies underestimate learning by using environments that differ in detrimental ways from actual language. And this is part of a broader project of an attempt to use information theoretic measures to explain language learning and language structure overall. And I want to thank all of you, and in particular, Ori Lavi-Rothbein, who's here, who this is part of her PhD project.